Dear audience, welcome back. A friendly reminder that you can also join the debate on social media with the hashtag EIF20. Our next discussion will be all about trade. And before diving into the topic with our experts, I invite you to answer the following Slido poll. Should the EU attach additional conditions, such as labor provisions, to free trade agreements? To tackle this and other points, I'd like to introduce Tomi Huhtanen, Executive Director of the Martin Center, who will moderate the next panel debate, The Transition of Global Trade, Finding a New Balance Between Openness and Protection. Tomi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, and welcome everybody to Economic Ideas Forum 2020 and its second panel on trade. Economic Ideas Forum has existed already more than 10 years, and in almost in every Economic Ideas Forum we had the trade panel. Usually we focus on EU-US trade relations, its TTIP developments, or WTO. Often these topics are very technical, and sometimes it's difficult to make it interesting. But in these years, and especially this year, there's a lot of things happening with trade, a lot of challenges, which is not maybe good for trade, but at least it makes excellent discussion. We hope so. First of all, we have Corona, this Corona epidemic. This has had huge impact on companies, but not only companies itself, but also how they trade. Secondly, we have a lot of trade tensions globally, US, EU tensions. We have US-China tension. And also from European side, maybe a view for new strategy. We have new trade commissioner, and we are going to discuss about EU's new line. And overall, in the background, what we see is the rise of populism, which of course has a huge impact on how trade is seen and how trade is accepted, especially the new trade deals. So we have four excellent panelists here. Welcome you all. First of all, Michael Hager, Head of Cabinet of Vice President Dombrovskis. Welcome. We have Julio Winkler, Member of the Parliament, but also Vice President of the European Parliament Trade Committee. Welcome, old good friend of Martin Center. We have Jake Jennings from AT&T. Jake is the Assistant Vice President and Head of Global Trade Policy for AT&T. AT&T is our loyal partner since 10 years, not only making good products, but excellent contributions in our debate year after year. And then we have a professor, Anu Platform, Professor of Law and International Organization at the Columbia Law School. So with these four persons, I'm sure we have outstanding discussion. So we start with from Michael Hager. As said, European Commission has a new trade commissioner, and who just took over. And one of his important opening speeches, he said, the EU remains open for free and fair trade, but at the same time, in a more conflictual international trading environment, we are going to be more assertive in defending our own rights, in defending European companies, in leveling the playing field. That is quite strong, a new language from the European Union. So what does this mean in relation of European Union and US in trade relations? What does it mean EU vis-à-vis China? Could you lay us out what is the Commission's approach and maybe new strategy? Mr. Hager, floor is yours. Microphone, maybe. Mr. Hager.
Now you hear me.
Excellent.
I hope.
Much better.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good. No, thanks a lot for the kind invitation and the excellent panel I'm on here. Of course, what we need to see, and you mentioned it, the international aspects, the whole surroundings have changed in the past years. And what was a stable environment in the past is not a stable environment any longer. So what we need to make sure is that the place Europe has in this world is safeguarded. Trade has an important, or is an important element for our prosperity, competitiveness, well-being, and all that we need to protect. So the naive approach of just doing trade for the sake of doing trade will not pay off for us. That's why what we developed and what my boss, the executive vice president, has pushed forward is the concept of open strategic autonomy, which says all. So it means open on the one hand for trade, but it also means that we take care for ourselves, that we're not naive, that we protect our consumers and our companies. And that we need to make clear in our negotiations internationally on the WTO side, but also bilaterally with our trading partners. And that means we cannot avoid conflicts as well, but we need to make our voice clearly heard.
All right, thank you, Mr. Hager. That's a good opening. We started from European side, so we will move to the US side. Professor Bradford, in fact, is an author of one new publication, Brussels Effect. And those who know the term in trade circles, it's very important. It basically means that the European Union as such has a so high volume that when EU regulates something, all the global companies immediately need to take to account. And Professor Bradford is in fact the person who coined the term, and his new book is out. It's an excellent publication. And to follow up to that, I would ask Professor Bradford, if you think the Brussels effect and look at the current situation with Corona and all these dimensions, also what Mr. Hager was mentioning, how do you see the Brussels effect to develop in the upcoming months and years? What direction do you think the dynamics is taking?
In many ways, the Brussels effect relies on the idea that globalization remains robust. The idea that companies are competing on a global marketplace whereby they have benefits in conforming their production and conduct to a uniform standard. That is the precondition for them to be able to rely on a single standard that comes from the European Union. So if the COVID was going to bring an end to globalization, as some projected, we would see the end of the Brussels effect. That would certainly compromise the European Union's ability to regulate the global marketplace because there would not be a real global marketplace to regulate. What we have not seen, however, is a retreat in globalization as a choice by companies. We have not seen extensive repatriation of supply chains. Global companies remain committed to globalization. They cannot start producing and sourcing and selling domestically. But at the same time, what we do see, though, and COVID has accelerated this, we see a very thin commitment by the governments to globalization. So we see increasing pressures to re-erect the trade barriers, build those walls between nations. And that obviously would be potentially slowing down globalization. But if you think about, though, what the crises generally do to European Union regulatory power, and if we think about global trade, the real barriers are about regulation. So this remains a crucial topic. I would say there are a couple of reasons why the Brussels effect is likely to remain robust even throughout the crisis. So one is that if you look at the challenges that the European Union has faced, normally we tend to see a stronger union emerging from the crisis. So we have seen both a stronger financial architecture to have been built after the euro crisis. We see more investments in common border controls after the migration crisis. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see, for instance, new powers to be transferred to the EU when it comes to public health after this crisis. So we might see even more robust European Union regulating globally. And the second is that if you think about the nature of the European Union's regulatory power, it rests in its technocratic nature. So it is not as vulnerable to the deep economic and public health crisis that is keeping the political debate and political decision makers busy. Because if you think about who is drafting the regulations for the global marketplace, they are the Commission bureaucrats, and they remain focused on their assigned regulatory domains. So we are likely to see a massive push towards the Digital Services Act or the Green Deal and all the regulations that come with that. So those are just some of the dimensions that lead me to think that even though globalization has its challenges, the European Union's robust role as the regulator of that marketplace will withstand the crisis relatively well.
Thank you, Professor Bradford. You had a couple of excellent points. First of all, that indeed what we are seeing by numbers, that the trade numbers actually are not so much affected, of course, immediately by Corona, but it doesn't respond to political, discussion. There seems to be some misconnection. And one other point which you made, this technocratic nature. So that actually it's a good bridge to Mr. Winkler, who is as said, he's a vice president in the European Parliament's Trade Committee, and following this political discussion, because you could say that Professor Bradford was making the point that, okay, the technocratic nature which drives the thing and not so much politics. So how do you see in the European Parliament, the committee, and what is the atmosphere, first of all, referring to what Mr. Hager said about approach, upcoming trade negotiations, and so, atmosphere. What is the mood in the Parliament? Parliament which plays very important role on accepting these agreements. Mr. Winkler.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first of all, good afternoon, and thank you for having me on this panel. Then, of course, I have to start immediately by saying that when you think about technocrats, then you think about the European Commission, first of all, and not the Parliament, because we are elected representatives of the European citizens. So it's, of course, a different story than the European Commission or DigiTrade. Of course, when you speak about atmosphere in the European Parliament, I have to tell you, yes, after 2019 elections, the atmosphere in the European Parliament has changed a little bit. I would say that we have moved a little bit closer to the citizen. There is a pressure of public scrutiny upon us as members of the Parliament. And I would say that the issue of transparency and the issue of scrutiny is something that defines also our ambitions in the International Trade Committee. Because what happened in the last term, I was also member of the Parliament between 2014 2019, and if you look at the level of the European Union trade policy, I think we have achieved a lot in the last 5 years. We had the FDI screening instrument, we had the conflict minerals regulation, which will enter into action next January. Then we had the TDI, the anti-dumping regulation. We had new free trade agreements, very important ones, ratified in the European Parliament with Singapore, with Vietnam and others. Now we have the feeling in the International Trade Committee that we also, as representatives, elected representatives of the people, we have to focus on implementation. We see that there are problems, for example, in the degree of utilization of the free trade agreements by SMEs. And this is really a very, very important issue, since we know all that SMEs are so important in all the economies of member states and in overall in the EU economy. We have these powers extended by the Lisbon Treaty and the changes in the treaties, which give us the power to monitor and to scrutiny. And we indeed wish to see more of those powers implemented. So we wish to have a close cooperation with the European Commission and with DigiTrade, which was the case before. I have to say, and I'm confident that the new trade commissioner will follow the steps of those who have been before him. Anyway, I think the first decision, or among the first decisions of Valdis Dombrovskis, President and Commissioner for Trade, which was to extend the public debate on the dialogue on the trade policy review. This was initially supposed to end in September. Now it was extended until mid-November. I think this is a very significant decision, because we have to hear the voices of our stakeholders, the European companies, the sectorial associations, and so on, and even, of course, the voice of citizens themselves. So I think it's a new era of openness, of necessity of more transparency, and of course, full of populistic traps, because the traps of populism and the traps of demagogy are always present in the activity of the European Parliament. I would say that we have to try to find the best ways to first of all to contribute to the debate now, because it's the stage of the debate, and then if in early 2021 we have the new trade policy document of the European Union built on the concept of open strategic autonomy, there is much to discuss, and we still have to fill this concept of open strategic autonomy with very clear content. But when we have it, and once we have it, then I think we will have a good basis on which to go on in this new world post-COVID, I hope, because I'm confident that very soon, or as soon as possible, we will enter the post-COVID era in trade and in economy and in our general activities.
Thank you, Mr. Winkler. You mentioned many issues to which we come back later. You also mentioned European companies, so that gives me an excuse to good bridge to give a floor to Mr. Jake Jennings, because AT&T is originally American company, but it's also operating in Europe and investing huge amounts of money and employing a lot of people. So indeed, and going back to this whole corona and trade policy and today's situation, because for example us, we here in studio, we are living in the middle of this whole issue of epidemics. So how should COVID-19 change the trade policy? Do you see anything, because there's a lot of discussion, the imminent change which the COVID brings, also to economy. So should trade policy somehow adapt? What does this mean, this current situation for trade policy as it stands today? So Mr. Jennings, it's yours.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy. Hope I'm coming through loud and clear. First of all, we want to thank the Martin Center, President Zerdina, Tommy and Margarita. We are, full supporters of the work you're doing. And this goes back to our head of government affairs, Jim Ciccone, under the Bush administration, under George H. Bush, firm supporter of the transatlantic relationship, the dialogue. And that's going to continue under our new leader, Ed Gillespie, formerly of the Republican National Committee, definitely commitments to the transatlantic relationship. What COVID has really done in our minds is highlighted the importance of the digital economy. Not that there wasn't emphasis on the digital economy before COVID hit, but what it's really done is, highlighted not just trade policy, but also domestic policies. Everything from access to broadband domestically, addressing, telehealth, distance learning, education. So I think highlighting those issues, those domestic policies are becoming trade issues. And I think Professor Bradford, said it well with the domestic regulations now are having an impact on global trade. From a global perspective, when we engage in discussions on trade policy, we spend probably equal time with the ministries of trade as we do with the domestic regulators, especially on the digital issues. So I think as the EU goes forward with its trade policy review, and I want to compliment the EU for doing that, because it really gives, at least from AT&T perspective, a chance to take a step back, look at what are all the issues we're facing. Because in the past, most of the discussion was on free trade. Now more and more we're talking about fair trade. What does that mean? And how do domestic regulations play into the trade policies? And just at a very high level, some of the key issues still remain: basic market access, the ability to enter a market and provide cross-border services, protection of intellectual property. That is crucial, not just from a company's perspective, but also from a tax perspective. We're seeing more and more of online piracy. When that occurs, not only is that stealing from the companies, but you're losing tax revenue. And in this COVID time, looking for tax revenues as the economy's decline is even more important than it was before. And then the digital trade front on cross-border data flows, How do you address those? How do you address cybersecurity policies that are not just protectionist but are interoperable and global? So as a global company, yes, we do provide global service, but we're also local, whether it's on the AT&T side or the Warner Media side on our production. So Tommy, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jennings. Listen, as I have you here, I have to have one question which I cannot avoid, which is of course the fact that in 1 week from now there's a historic day in the United States. It's upcoming elections. We have two candidates, and I have to ask, how does will it play out? What do you think? You know, there's two possibilities: President Trump or President Biden. And so, those two scenarios, what do you think they mean for would mean for trade? It's a big question, but maybe a short answer if you can. Mr. Jennings?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was hoping to hear from the other panelists first on their insights. You know, I think we've seen, at least from the Trump administration, you know, a focus, I think he calls it America First, a lot of, you know, on the free trade side. So we'll see. We expect that probably will continue out, the use of tariffs as a trade negotiating leverage, especially on the China front. Under a Biden presidency, there's not been a lot publicly available. What we've seen, and also from his work under President Obama, was kind of really focusing on domestic issues and then looking at institutions and multilateralism. So we could see a refocus on the WTO, even on the IMF and how trade policies related to some of the international financing and engagement, and then discussions with the U.S. allies. But again, there has not been a lot publicly available from the administration or from the campaign on what to expect. And you know, we're going to be sitting back late Tuesday night, watching the results come in.
All right, thank you. And our other, I would say, panelist from the US side, Professor Bradford, what is your analysis? How do you see how the trade will play out in a scenario that Biden wins or if Trump continues? Professor.
So I think we would certainly see a shift, because what we are witnessing right now in the United States is a big departure from the policies that have been guiding the US trade agenda in the past. So the US has been the architect of the global trade order, and in the last 4 years, it has been the architect of its unraveling. So if you think about how much this administration has done to set us back in terms of the commitment to free trade, he has turned his back to international trade agreements, walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership is just one example. The United States has undermined the functioning of the WTO by refusing to appoint members to its appellate body, making the dispute settlement very difficult to remain functional. And if you think about the extent to which the US has been launching trade wars against the not just enemies, but its closest allies, including its 3 closest trade partners, Canada and the European Union and Mexico. So I would expect that to change. So these trade wars have been very costly for the United States. They have been against the interest of US companies, US consumers, and US workers. And I would expect the Biden administration to stop fighting those wars. That doesn't mean that we are immediately going back to the trade order that we saw before. So I would expect the Biden administration to continue to expect that the WTO would be reformed, but it would be willing to work with its partners, including the European Union, to do so. I think the big challenge for the Biden administration will be is that there is so much that it needs to get done. And it's unclear, and this is where I agree with the fellow panelists here and Jake Jennings' comments, that we don't have public information, at least enough to understand how salient trade will be among the many issues in which this new administration under Biden would be trying to reverse the course and reinstitute a different course for the United States for the following 4 years.
Thank you, Mr. Hager. To continue what Professor Bradford was saying about WTO, How do you see, especially taking into account in fact that now we have it's like basically a stalemate. We have this temporary arbitrary system, which several countries kind of sidelining the normal procedures. So how do you see now WTO from the EU perspective? What role it will play in the future? Is that the main platform, or it's just the bilateral trade negotiations? On how shall we move forward, Mr. Hager?
I think what Professor Bradford rightly said is that the essence of multilateral order is, of course, a functioning WTO. So the appellate body as one example where we see we need to overcome the barriers we are facing there. And this requires collaboration from all sides, from all partners. The WTO is an important institution, and we need to keep it, and we need to focus on it, maybe even more than in the past years. Whenever there is a change next week or then in January, of course, or I would guess it is easier then to discuss all these things. But even if there is no change, I think we need to continue with the like-minded to push for a reform. And I also think that some points the US made are correct. Yeah? It's not that there is no need for reform, that there is no need for criticism and tackling that. But we need to do it in the right and proper way. And that requires a lot of interaction between the members of the WTO. I raised the appellate body, so the whole issue of the dispute settlement, I think, needs a fresh look. It also needs a fresh look how the WTO is monitoring the international trade, how negotiations are done, how new initiatives are taken up. Take, for example, what the European Union initiated, trade and climate. So how we tackle these things, current issues, climate change, also on the WTO level. All that we need to discuss. And I think the new Director General of the WTO, we are in the last phase of the selection process, could help in getting that debate rolling, maybe also in a way that there's a fresh phase, which helps us to overcome the stalemate we have seen. From our side, and the trade policy review will, of course, lay out our strategy in that sense. From our side, we are committed to work together and to get something done in terms of reforming the WTO.
And what do you think about this whole EU and US together working vis-a-vis the challenges that China poses to WTO? Do you see that would be the strong area of cooperation? How do you see those dynamics?
We are already cooperating, yeah, and we are already talking with the US counterparts on how to tackle these issues. I mean, the state-owned enterprises, the subsidies, and all that. These are areas we need to discuss. But also we are talking with the Chinese. And I think what is required is not antagonizing each other. It's getting into a multilateral dialogue and to discuss these things properly. And we need to push forward also to get to solutions. It can't be an endless discussion. But there we need partners who are first willing to discuss and second willing to find solutions. That is not always the case. So that's why we look for the future that, also there is a better understanding on our interlocutors, being it in Asia, being it on the other side of the Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Hager. As in our title of our panel, it speaks about the balance between openness and protection. I would like to go to Mr. Winkler, take into account what Mr. Hager just said. So should Europe be more defensive? Should Europe apply more defensive tools to protect the single market? Screening the investments, protection of critical digital infrastructure, reviewing EU procurement rules. You mentioned already couple points already in your introduction, but maybe you can further continue. How defensive should we be in the European Union?
Uh, we just spoke about the international institutions and namely about the WTO. And I think that the European Union has to find, and of course it's about Digitrade, but also it's about the European Parliament and the signals that we give to our Directorate General in the Commission. We have to find the right balance of being able to protect our companies without becoming protectionist. And because we are not very fond of those who are becoming protectionist. We are not very fond about the fact that we see on the global stage inward-looking economic nationalism. We see it across the Atlantic, of course, unfortunately. We see also market distorting practices, not only in China, but enough of those market distorting practices and unfair competition coming from China. So what should be our red line? Our red line should be the measures which are WTO compatible, because if we are WTO compatible, then it means that we are not protectionist, but we are entitled to reciprocity, and we are entitled to a stronger toolbox. And this is something that also we hear a lot from the European Commission, that we have to strengthen our toolbox. And this is also, I believe, coming with the trade policy review and the concrete measures that, or the concrete new instruments that we can apply. Of course, if we talk with European companies, then one thing that we hear quite often is that even those tools that exist are not applied swiftly enough. So more speed, faster reaction, I think, is needed. And this is something that comes back again and again in the last 2 or 3 years when we discuss with associations, with sectorial associations in European Union, or with our economic stakeholders. Then, of course, we have also an issue of period analyze, if I may call it like this. For example, and I give you something also which is coming from discussing with companies. Let's look at the free trade agreements of the European Union and the effects of those free trade agreements, including the degree of utilization of various preferences. And if we make an analysis at a regional level, not even at member state, if we go to regional level, then we see that unfortunately there is a phenomenon that the benefits of the free trade agreements are sometimes placed in very different regions than the costs of the free trade agreements, because we know very well that each free trade agreement comes with some costs. We have to restructure, we have to rethink certain sectors of our industry, of our manufacturing sectors, and so on. And if we have a too big differentiation between those regions where we can find the benefits of free trade agreements and we can find the costs of our free trade agreements, then it means that we have a problem that we have to tackle. So I would say that the right balance is not easy to find, but finding the right balance is not only an issue of global relations and discussing with our partners on the global scene and under the WTO, which of course has to be reformed. And I totally agree with Michael Hager. Yes, we have to reform the WTO and we have to find partners for this process, but it's not enough to look outside. We have also to look a little bit inside to see what has changed in the last few years.
Thank you, Mr. Winkler. You made an excellent point about the new, character of trade deals. So I'm going to make a question which I'm going to actually put to the whole panel. Indeed, because of the populism, but already before, there has been this discussion indeed that the trade deals should not be anymore, because we go now for the pure traffic to regulation and standards. So therefore, it should not be only about numbers per se, but there should be some condition links, for example, labor provisions. And we see now also as how the kind of the dynamics around Mercosur, how Mr. Dombrovskis is kind of defending the deal vis-a-vis whole discussion on the climate policy. So what is happening? Is there some new form of trade deals? Is the old trade deals pass away and now something new is coming up? How do you see that? That question I would first put to Mr. Jennings. So is there some kind of new era in the trade deals coming?
I think that the short answer is we don't know. We talked earlier about level playing field, domestic regulation is becoming more and more of a trade barrier. I think the traditional free trade agreements still have opportunities where you can make trade-offs of certain issues, cost benefits, as was discussed. But at the same time, as I go back to recovering from COVID, one of the things everyone will be looking for is investment and innovation, and that could come from domestic investment or foreign direct investment. Some of the principles of the WTO I think are crucial, especially national treatment. I think that's been kind of translated a little bit into what we call now level playing field. But discriminatory practices, they do place restrictions on investment. One thing I'll highlight is the use of digital trade, digital services has grown exponentially since the last WTO negotiating round. So a lot of these issues that you'll hear us talking about, whether it's data flows, localization requirements, cybersecurity practices, those have not been embedded into the WTO framework. Now, the good news is there's negotiations underway under the auspices of the WTO to address these issues from like-minded countries. The bad news is those negotiations have been ongoing for over a year and a half. We'll see if they're able to reach a conclusion. We've seen some of the digital trade issues included in a phased approach with the US, Japan. I know the UK, the Japanese agreement also addresses those issues, CP, TPP. And then I know the EU is starting to look at those issues as well. But I think it's going to be a process. And I do want to highlight the importance of the WTO and the importance of a rules-based global trading system to really facilitate this investment and innovation we keep talking about.
All right, Mr. Hager, the same question, and especially in the what we spoke about trade policy review and the 2021 paper. And is there kind of new form of trade deals coming? And also maybe you can mention something about this Mercosur deal and how do you see that going? As we are using the opportunity. Mr. Hager, floor is yours.
Yes. I think we need a separate panel for that.
Okay, well we have only this one. Sorry.
What I would start with. Indeed, you mentioned that there are lots of things around now what we call the classical trade policy. So to distinguish trade policy and what I would call the policies of trade, climate, labor, whatever. And there is a tendency to inject all of these policies of trade into trade policy. And of course, that blurs, on the one hand, the overall or the first objective of facilitating trade, ensuring that there is a removal of barriers, that there is the contribution to growth, competitiveness, all that. And of course, there are also limits. I mean, if we start to overload the boat with other policies, not only the focus on trade is diminishing, also the question comes up with whom we want to trade with. Because we can, of course, try to impose our standards. We can try to impose what we would like to see all over the world, but we need to negotiate with partners. And what we might win on the one hand, we might lose on the other. All that we need to have in mind when we discuss these things. And I think it requires a careful reflection on where to put the limits. and how we can be also a reliable partner in the negotiations with third countries. It is much more difficult, of course, to negotiate environmental standards. You mentioned Mercosur, I'll come back to that, than with other countries like Australia or Canada. But to have a global trading order and to have these free trade agreements we are pursuing, we cannot focus only on the few like-minded around in the world. We need to be honest and serious also in the discussions and the negotiations with other partners who are more difficult when it comes to Paris Agreement, climate change, and so on. I think the Mercosur agreement is, a point, a focal point of all of that. And what would be good is to take a step back and to see what is actually necessary to fulfill and to come to the ratification of this agreement. And I think it's clear that just to pursuing this will not fly. I think both sides are clear on that and agree on that as well. So we are in discussions with the partners in the Mercosur countries, how to ensure, how to get pre-commitments and clear steps on what needs to be undertaken to make sure that the ratification can be undertaken. This might take a bit of time, but I think it's necessary and useful to do that operation.
Thank you. By the way, viewers, you can participate in this debate in Slido. There's a vote going on, which I come back in couple of minutes. But the same question about the new type of traded deals. Question mark. Professor Bradford, what do you?
So, Tommy, this is something that the European Union has been trying to do for a long time. So the EU has been very active in incorporating its various regulatory preferences in the trade agreements. So whether we talk about labor provisions, human rights, rule of law, and competition law, and so forth. But the EU's record of success has been probably mixed at best. So we might be able to successfully persuade our trading partners to incorporate those changes into their domestic regulatory regimes. But pursuing enforcement of those provisions, it is another story. And I think few would say that the EU has been very successful, for instance, in exporting rule of law and other provisions, even in our own neighborhood. So in many ways, you are dependent on the cooperation of the governments and then the domestic constituencies that then allow those governments to effectively implement those policies. So in many ways, the EU has been much more successful in unilaterally exporting its standards. So Mr. Jennings was talking a lot about the importance of digital trade. And if you think about the influence that the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, has had worldwide, with over 120 countries having a GDPR type of regulation in place, that is not something whether the EU was leveraging its network of trade agreements to export those standards. It was really when the EU was regulating its own single market, and so many companies worldwide that operate globally and needed the access to the EU market did incorporate those policies and did decide that they were better off following the EU standards globally. So in many ways, when the EU, even though the EU is not a unilateralist by choice, the EU is more of a contingent unilateralist that would like to pursue joint standards in the WTO, other multilateral, bilateral settings. Often the EU's record is actually more successful when it has harnessed the power of the markets and the self-interest of the global corporations to export those standards than relying on the trade agreements alone.
Thank you, Professor Professor Bradford. I think one could also make an argument that these provisions sometimes are you have trade deals have becoming more political. Therefore, you need to add provisions or you add policies. One of the reasons. But then when you add them, they become more political. The trade deals. So you could make that point. But Mr. Winkler, what you already referred to that, but what do you think what has been discussed, this adding provisions, the new form of trade deals, what would you say?
First of all, I think everybody knows that exactly the European Parliament is one of the places and one of the forums in which we have this very strong push for different kind of provisions in the free trade agreements. We have SME chapters, we have trade and sustainable development clauses. We have labor clauses and human rights dialogue, and all those, I think, we can incorporate in what we can call the next generation free trade agreements or the new generation free trade agreements. And it is a reality that there is probably a huge and massive demand and push from our citizens towards those kinds of extensions of issues. What I strongly oppose, and also the European People Party and the EPP group in the European Parliament opposes, is attaching conditionalities and becoming unrealistic. Because indeed trade is a vehicle to promote European values, which we like to call, and of course we think that they are universal values. I won't repeat the human rights, democracy, separation of powers, and so on. But in the same time, as it was rightly said before, we need partners not only among those like-minded. And I remember the recent debate about the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. It was the first time that the European Union secured a deal with a communist country, because Vietnam is under the rule of the Communist Party. And if you think that you could change the regime in Vietnam by a free trade agreement, then probably you are a little bit wrong. If you think, and I think that you can change realities in Vietnam. For example, you can change the labor conditions in Vietnam. You can change the climate sensitivity of Vietnamese government. If you think that you can change many aspects which are reverberating in the everyday life of people, then I think that that is true and even can be expected. We are there to explain our values, to maintain dialogue, and to convince decision makers that our way is a good way, and it's good for people, and it's good for companies, for the economy, and so on. So I think that here again we are in a situation of feeling the right balance and coming to the right expectations. So I think this is a process of change. This is a process of transition. I know transition is tiring because we are simultaneously in so many transitions, but also this is a transition towards a new world of trade. And I would say that maybe trade was classically 20 or 30 years ago, trade was the in-camera field. Trade negotiations were about trade specialists, and nobody talked about them. That world is already over and done, and now we are in a new world of trade in which trade comes in agora, if I may say so. Trade is something that people want to understand, and even people as constituents, as citizens, wants to influence. And that is a legitimate expectation of European citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Winkler. And now I give floor to Anna to put on the floor the questions from the audience, and also go to this famous Slido.
Thank you.
Anna.
Thank you, Tommy. And let's indeed have a look at the feedback from our audience. So, to the question, should the EU attach additional conditions, such as labor provisions, to free trade agreements? We've seen that the majority said yes, with 62%, and 38% voted for no. But now I'd like to move on to a question that we have from the audience, indeed.
Let's do that.
Will there be a free trade agreement between the EU and the UK? So, Tommy, I leave the question with you for further discussion.
All right, that's an interesting question. Thank you, Anna. So, panelists, who would like to guess? will be there a trade? The question from audience: is there a trade deal between the EU and UK? Who is voluntary? Well, maybe. Okay, Professor Bradford.
Thank you, Tommy. I'm happy to go first. I feel very strongly about this and would like to hope that sanity will prevail and there are enough governments who care about their citizens, their well-being and the future of their continents and countries, that there will indeed be a deal. I don't think there will be an ambitious deal. We are far from that. But at least if we have some kind of a deal on which we can then build on, we could at least make sure that we are not disrupting our economic and political relationship to the extent that it would be very difficult to repair. But in many ways, if we think about who needs this deal, both the EU and the UK will be much better off with this deal. But the UK will need the deal even more. So if you think about the importance of the single market as a destination for the UK export, it is about 50% of the UK trade. The EU is the #1 destination for critical UK industries, whether we talk about automobiles, aerospace, financial services, chemical industry, pharmaceuticals. These companies need to access the EU. And there is no substitute in waiting for there to be a deal with the United States that could absorb all that export capacity that would no longer be going to the EU. And if you also think about another way to measure the trade dependence between the two, there are over 600 products that the UK currently sources only from the European Union. There is one product that the European Union sources exclusively from the United Kingdom. So in many ways, the cost for the UK to walk away, especially because it is upset about something akin to state aid, which would not normally be a core interest of the UK government, that this Conservative government is willing to go at length in endangering the future relationship that is so important to them, so that they would reserve the right to subsidize their key companies. So at the same time, I know fish is important, but it is not the worth to hold hostage the deal that is also in the deep interest of the European citizens. So I certainly very much hope, and I'm an optimist, so let me end on the note in my remarks, that there will be a deal. Not ambitious, not as great, not equivalent to the value of UK being part of the single market, but at least it is better than a hard Brexit.
Thank you, Professor. Mr. Winkler, you have a floor.
Very briefly, I take advantage of the fact that I'm the only politician on this panel. And right after the remarks of Professor Bradford, I would say that it seems to us politicians that we have to say in the European Union that, oh my God, but it's the European Union which needs much more this agreement than the United Kingdom, because this is the way to convince Prime Minister Boris Johnson and to give him a platform of wanting to close a deal. I don't know if this is really the best joke I made in the last time, but indeed it is an issue of the clock ticking. We have maybe the negotiators have maybe 2 or 3 weeks from this moment to close a deal. And indeed, this deal will have to be ratified by the European Parliament. And this is something that should not be taken for granted. So it will be a debate, it will be analyzed, it will be scrutiny. And I think that those red lines, which have been very clearly expressed by the European Parliament, should not be overlooked, because in case of overlooking our deadlines, there will be no ratification of unconform EU-UK deal in our parliament.
Thank you, Mr. Winkler. And of course, now a commission. Mr. Hager, I almost can see a paper on your table. I think it says UK, but I'm not quite sure what it means.
They are there.
Yeah, okay, they are there. So how do you see that? This is a question for you, Mr. Hager.
So I fully agree. I mean, we need to come to reason and responsibility. But I mean, the best, I think, comparison is made to a drama from Shakespeare. Of course, you have some wonderful bloodsheds, some treason, some all these elements need to be in a drama, and we're in the middle of it. But in the end, we need to find a way out of this. And I mean, taking hostage fisheries, taking hostage financial services, all this we need to bring together. I think the reason and the responsibility, and also to show that okay, there is a common understanding after decades of a lot of integration. We cannot forget this simply. So my hope is as well that the negotiations of Michel Barnier come to a success. Yes, the clock is ticking, but we are not that far away. There are a lot of things where we can agree on. There are some issues where we are apart, and now it means banging heads together in the last act of the drama.
Yes, indeed, banging heads. Mr. Jennings, AT&T is very present in Europe, as we said, but also in UK. Do you want to comment on the EU-UK possible trade deal? Do you have Mr. Jennings?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, coming through okay?
Yeah, you're coming through. So, AT&T, your company is very present in UK. It's very present in the EU. So do you want to comment on this possible trade deal on some way?
Yeah, so I don't think it was a surprise that my broadband connection paused just as you were asking the question. But the short answer, I think Professor Bradford is spot on. From an AT&T perspective, we hope so. Certainty is always preferred to the uncertainty of what a hard Brexit would look like. And it's our hope that there is a deal struck between the EU and the UK, and we definitely need to build off of that. I think the short answer is if like-minded countries cannot come to an agreement on trade, what does that say for addressing the more complex issues where you have different policies put in place? So it is very important and something we are watching closely.
Thank you. We are heading towards the end of our panel, but there's still some time. So, as I said, some years ago, there was no decent trade panel if you didn't bang heads on TTIP. So, and that remains important. We have two panelists from EU, two panelists from the US. So let's make a final round about the future of the possible EU-US trade agreement. How should we move on? Is there any chance for that? How should we take some pieces of the old TTIP concept, for example, the regulation and standards, and try to build something around? Or is it possible, or is it impossible? So let's make a round. Let's start from for example, Mr. Winkler. If you were nodding head, so you seem to have a view on that. So
yes,
TTIP
yes.
2.0, 3.0, 4.0, how shall we play it?
I'm
also
not
make,
sure it's
sorry, maybe some
3.0.
closing comments for if you want to say.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I think it's 3.0, but I'm not sure. But anyway, one important issue, and we have discussed already in this afternoon, to choose between the United States and China is not a binary choice for the European Union. I think those who are promoting this idea that we have to choose either China or the US, they are on a wrong path, and we have to be treating as partners also our transatlantic partners and also China as much as possible. And we have not to fall into the traps of the trade war, which is going on for the last 2 years, 1.5 years, but we have to keep our doors open for the transatlantic partnership. Second idea, of course, Brexit means that the center of the European Union, maybe it was UK, I'm not sure, but some say that looking from Washington, you could see Berlin or Brussels through London. I'm not sure it's that is quite clear, but it's clear that after Brexit, hopefully we have an orderly Brexit, so we have a deal, even if it will be a weak deal, but this has to be rearranged a little bit between Brussels or Berlin or Paris or Warsaw and Washington. And finally, if you said that also I have to say goodbye now, final remarks, I think that it is very, very important that we give this signal, and I think there is common understanding between the panelists that it's very clear that even in a time of volatility, even in a time of many transitions, Brexit, sustainability transition, digital transition, and the 21st century transition, the European Union remains open for business, and that we are promoting the multilateral rules-based trading order, and we are reliable partners to reinforce and see a new WTO emerging, and that among our partners we are counting quite clearly, and this is a majority in the European Parliament for this. We are counting the United States, our transatlantic partner, as one of our strong partners in future also.
Thank you. And so very shortly for the rest of the speakers, because indeed we are running already running over time. Important point, EU-US trade agreement, how we should move on way forward. Professor Bradford.
So unfortunately, I don't think there will be a transatlantic trade agreement, even if we have President Biden governing the next 4 years. I don't think it's just enough of a priority for the United States. That does not mean that there will not be transatlantic cooperation and the ability to pursue our interests jointly. There could be a way that we can agree on the global digital tax in the OECD. If you think about President Biden even floating the idea of carbon tariffs, so leveraging the WTO consistent way to deploy the trade system to further some of our joint goals to fight the climate change. And I think importantly, I completely agree with Mr. Winkler that the EU should be strategic and hedge and cooperate with different partners and not choose between the US and China. I think a good example is that the EU was able to cooperate with China on a temporary dispute settlement mechanism in the WTO when the US was not willing to do so. But there's also a very important agenda for the EU and the US to pursue jointly. And here I want to bring a lot of the issues that Mr. Jennings emphasized when it comes to the digital economy. So I think the US and the EU can work together to defend liberal democratic vision of the internet and counter, for instance, jointly the aggressive effort by China to export its digital authoritarian vision and technology and standards around the world. So I think there is much to be done, but I don't think there will be a comprehensive trade agreement such as the TTIP.
Thank you, Professor Bradford. And Mr. Jennings, in very short, 1 or 2 minutes, important question, but the short answers sometimes are the best.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank the Martin Center. This has been a fantastic panel. Looking forward to more of these. Short answer is I had to try to recall what does TTIP even stand for. It's been so long since we've had those negotiations. But I just go back to let's start focusing on some of these issues like digital trade. That's going to be the hallmark of COVID recovery and build from there. And we at AT&T are committed to a rules-based global trading system.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Hager, final word, Commission, will the EU-US trade deal someday happen or not?
Well, I think the first point is seeing all the conflicts and the battlegrounds we have. The first is to overcome that. We need to solve that airplane conflict. We need to solve all these investigations. The digital tax is one element, of course. All that first we need to clear before looking forward into anything else. And I would agree with Professor Bradford that working together for a WTO reform, to use that environment and to link up and see that there is potential in that multilateral order would be a great step forward. So I would not grab the fruits highest on the tree. I would see what are the low-hanging fruit we can achieve and building on that trust and confidence to develop further. But I don't think, as the other speakers have said, that in the foreseeable future there would be a trade deal with the US.
So thank you, and thank you very much for whole panel, all the panelists. The discussion is over. I think it has been exciting discussion. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, all the followers. And Anna, floor is yours.
Thank you, Tommy. Indeed, what an excellent panel to end our day. Ladies and gentlemen, for today, it's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us, and we are looking forward to welcoming you tomorrow at 10 with 2 more debates. Thank you again, and see you tomorrow. Have a nice evening.